Hello there, welcome back to Coco Campus. Today we are gonna study the anatomy of the forearm and hand musculature. Now, let's take the forearm first. It has two compartments, the anterior compartment and the posterior compartment. The anterior compartment of the forearm is called flexor pronator group. The anterior compartment of the forearm is dedicated primarily to flexion of the wrist and digits and pronation of the forearm. It has superficial, intermediate, and deep layers. Okay, so let us look at the superficial flexor layer. The first muscle is the pronator teres. It has two heads. The origin consists of two heads. One is humeral head, which is the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The other is ulnar head. The medial ulnar head is the coronoid process. Now let us look at the insertion. The insertion is a rough impression of the middle third of the lateral surface of the radius. Once again, insertion is at the middle third of the lateral surface of the radius. Now, let us look at the innervation. The innervation consists of the median nerve. C6, C7. And the primary action is that it is the major pronator of the arm. So, pronator of the forearm and assist in elbow flexion. Primary pronator of the forearm and assists in elbow flexion. Now, let us go on towards our next muscle, the flexor carpi radialis. Let us look at the origin. It's the medial epicondyle via the common flexor origin. The insertion is at the anterior aspect of the bases of the second and third metacarpals. Its innervation is once again the median nerve, C6, C7. And its primary action is flexion and abduction of the wrist. Now, the word abduction means move away, right? Radial deviation of the wrist. Now, our next muscle is the palmaris longus. It is again the same origin, medial epicondyle via the flexor origin, via the common flexor origin, same as flexor carpi radialis. However, the insertion is at the flexor retinaculum and the apex of the palmar aponeurosis. Next, we have the innervation. Once again, the median nerve, C7, C8. Let us look at the function. What does this muscle do? It tenses the palmar aponeurosis. And it is also a weak wrist flexor. Okay, so let's move on towards the next muscle. Your next muscle is the flexor carpi ulnaris, FCU. This one, it once again has two heads. It has a humeral head and an ulnar head. Humeral head is the medial epicondyle. And ulnar head is the olecranon and posterior border of the ulna. Now let us look at the insertion. Its insertion consists of pisiform bone. If you remember, pisiform is part of your carpus. Hook of Hammett and fifth metacarpal base. So let's hear the insertion again. The pisiform bone, hook of Hammett, and the base of the fifth metacarpal. The innervation of FCU is done by the ulnar nerve, C7, C8. Its major action or function is flexion and adduction of the wrist. Once again, flexion and adduction of the wrist. Now, very quick information. The flexor carpi radialis is an essential landmark for the radial pulse. Okay? And palmaris longus is vestigial in humans, and it is absent in about 10 to 15% of the people. Okay, so let's move on. Oh, and there's also flexor carpi ulnaris, which is the only superficial flexor innervated by the ulnar nerve. Now let us move on to the intermediate flexor layer. We are done with the superficial flexor layer, so now we're gonna look at the intermediate flexor layer. Here there is something really funny, because there is just one single massive muscle, that is your flexor digitorum superficialis. There are not multiple muscles here, just one, and he knows how to do his job. FDS, flexor digitorum superficialis. He is responsible for the precise flexion of the middle phalanges. Let us look at the origin. It has two heads. First head is the humero-ulnar head. On the humerus, medial epicondyle and coronoid process on the ulna. That is the first head. And its second head, or the radial head, anterior oblique line on the radius. Radial head is at the anterior oblique line. So once again, two heads, humerolnar head and radial head. Its insertion is at the sides of the middle phalanges of the medial 4 digits. In other words, 2 to 5. Sides of 2 to 5 phalanges. Medial 4 digits. Now, let us look at the innervation. Median nerve. C7, C8, T1. Its primary action is the flexion of the PIP joints. PIP joints basically means proximal interphalangeal joints. Alright. And assist in flexion of MCP and wrist joints. MCP basically means metacarpophalangeal joints and wrist joints. Alright, so that's it. There was just one muscle right there and we talked about it. Moving on, let's go on towards the deep flexor plane. So we already finished superficial, we finished the intermediate layer, and finally we've reached the deep flexor plane. It consists of three muscles that provide power and fine control for distal flexion and forceful pronation. So let's look at the first muscle without further ado. You have your flexor digitorum profundus. Basically means your deep flexor digitorum muscle. Flexor digitorum profundus, FDP. Its origin is at the proximal 3/4 of the ulnar, of the anterior and medial surfaces of the ulna and interosseous membrane. Once again, origin is at the proximal 3/4 of the anterior and medial surfaces of the ulna and interosseous membrane. Its insertion is at the basis of the distal phalanges of the medial 4 digit. So think of it like this: 2 to 5, base of distal phalanges. Now here's something really cool. It has two innervations. Its lateral half is innervated by the median nerve. And its medial half is innervated by the ulnar nerve. The primary action is flexion of the DIP joints. DIP stands for distal interphalangeal joints. It is the primary flexor of fingers and wrist. Think of it like this: flexion of DIP joints. That's it. Let's move on towards the next muscle, you have your flexor pollicis longus, which means it is the long flexor of the thumb. FPL, flexor pollicis longus. Let us look at its origin. Its origin is at the anterior surface of the radius and adjoining interosseous membrane. Just remember anterior surface of radius. Let's go towards the insertion. Base of the distal phalanx of the thumb, pollex. Alright, just remember pollex. Let us go on towards its innervation. Median nerve, anterior interosseous branch, AIB. Median nerve, AIB. And its function, just like the name said, it is the primary flexor of the thumb joints, metacarpophalangeal and interphalangeal. So, primary flexor of the thumb. Simple. Moving on towards the next muscle, you have your pronator quadratus. Pronator quadratus muscle. Now, the origin of the pronator quadratus is the distal quarter of the anterior surface of the ulna. And its insertion is the distal quarter of the anterior surface of the radius. Very simple, right? Origin is at the distal quarter of the ulnar anterior surface, and insertion is at the distal quarter anterior surface of the radius. Quite simple, you can remember it pretty easily. And the nerve that supplies the pronator quadratus is the median nerve. Once again, anterior interosseous branch, AIB, median nerve. Now, what is the function? It is the principal initiator of pronation. In other words, it's the most important starter of pronation. It also stabilizes distal radioulnar joints, but important is principal initiator of pronation. Alright? Okay, here's something fun to remember. The pronator quadratus is the deepest muscle in the forearm and acts as the prime mover in pronation. However, pronator teres just acts as a synergist during rapid or forceful movements. Alright, I hope this helped. Let's see you again in another video pretty soon, which contains the posterior compartment of the forearm, the extensor supinator group. Alright, take care.